Dawn crept over Bath in pale gold, sliding across the rooftops and spilling into the quiet streets. Sarah's breath rose in the chill, the sound of her boots tapping against the cobblestones the only noise. She kept her head down, shoulders tucked against the cold, mind already on the bookshop key in her pocket. But he was there again. Just beyond the black iron park gate, a golden retriever sat in the frost-shadowed grass, still as a statue. His fur caught the light like it was made for it, every breath sending a faint cloud into the air. He didn't blink, didn't move. Just watched her as if waiting for a signal only he would understand. At his paws was today's offering, not the usual weathered stick or river stone, but something wrapped in soft blue ribbon. Sarah slowed, and for the first time, she realized she could not just walk past. The mornings in Bath have a certain kind of stillness, the sort that feels older than the city itself. Before the first rush of feet along the high street, before the buses rumble over the cobblestones, there is a hush that settles like a thin veil over the honey-colored stone buildings. You can hear the river Avon moving in the distance if you pause long enough, that slow and steady whisper against its banks. I have walked these streets in that quiet for years on my way to the shelter. It is the time of day I like best, when the air smells faintly of bread from the bakery in the square, and the shop shutters still hold the night's coolness. That is when I first noticed him, just beyond the black wrought-iron gate of Henrietta Park, in a patch of frost-kissed grass. A golden retriever sat as though he had been carved there. His coat caught the early light like it had been spun from threads of warm gold, and even from across the street, I could see the pale mist of his breath. He was perfectly still, but there was nothing vacant about his stillness. His head was tilted ever so slightly, his gaze fixed on a single figure walking along the opposite pavement. Sarah, she moved like someone who knew her route by heart. Her pace was even, her eyes low, her scarf wrapped close around her neck to guard against the winter bite. She did not see me. She did not need to. I saw in her the same thing I see in many of the people who come to the shelter, a body moving forward, but a heart that has been left somewhere else. The Golden's eyes followed her as if each step she took was a note in a song he knew. At his paws, placed neatly on the rim of frost, lay a stick. Not just any stick. The bark was stripped smooth, the ends worn round from being carried. It looked like it had been chosen, not found. She walked past without breaking her stride, but I noticed the faintest turn of her head once she was a few paces beyond the gate. Not enough to call it looking back, but enough to admit she knew he was there. Over the next few days I came to expect the sight. Each morning the Golden would be at his post, and Sarah would pass him by. Sometimes it was a stick, once it was a flat, pale river stone. Another morning, a leaf the color of buttercup, pressed flat as if kept between the pages of a book. Always placed with care. Always directly in front of him. I learned to read his posture. Dogs have a language that is honest in a way words rarely are. His tail would rest against the grass in an easy curve. His ears stayed relaxed, neither perked nor pinned. But his eyes never left her, not until she turned the corner toward the bookshop. Only then would he lower his head to rest on his paws, his breath slow and even, as if his work for the day was done. That particular morning, the one that would change the rhythm of things, was colder than usual. The kind of cold that makes your fingertips ache even inside your gloves and sends a fine veil of steam up from the drains. The park grass was stiff with frost, and the air smelled faintly metallic, like it sometimes does before snow. I was carrying a bag of donated towels to the shelter, my breath rising in little clouds before me. Sarah appeared on her usual path, scarf tucked high, her hands deep in her coat pockets. Her boots made that familiar click against the cobbles, a sound that always seems louder in the quiet of dawn. And there he was, waiting. But this time there was no stick, no stone, no leaf. Instead, resting perfectly at the tips of his paws, was something wrapped in a strip of soft blue ribbon. The color was the kind of blue you see in winter skies just after sunrise, when the light is still tender. The ends of the ribbon fluttered faintly in the breeze, the frost crystals on them catching the first gold of the day. I slowed my pace, watching. Sarah saw it too. I could tell by the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her steps faltered, just enough to break her even rhythm. She stopped for the briefest of moments, her eyes dropping to the ribbon, then lifting to the dog. He did not move. He only watched her with that steady, patient focus, the kind that seems to ask without demanding. Something in her face shifted. It was small, but I caught it, the flicker of something between curiosity and caution. Then she walked on, not quickly, not as if fleeing, but with a deliberate choice in each step, as though putting space between herself and whatever lay wrapped beneath that ribbon was necessary for now. She disappeared around the corner toward the bookshop, and Jasper, though I did not yet know his name, lowered his head to rest on his paws once more. I stood there a moment longer than I needed to, my bag of towels growing heavier in my arms. I have seen dogs wait for people before. Sometimes it is simple habit. Sometimes it is hope without reason. But sometimes, the rarest kind, it is purpose. And the purpose in that golden retriever's gaze was as clear as the morning light. That was the morning I began to pay attention not just to the dog, but to the space between him and Sarah. A space that, like frost on stone, was fragile enough to change with a single touch. Grief has a way of closing things. Sometimes it is a door you never meant to shut. Sometimes it is a window you do not even notice has been latched, until one day you try to push it open and find it stuck. I knew about Sarah's loss before I ever spoke to her. Bath is not a village, but it has a village memory, the kind that holds on to names and stories and repeats them in soft voices at market stalls and cafe counters. Her husband Daniel had been gone for nearly 2 years. Heart trouble, sudden enough that there was no long goodbye. They said it happened in winter, on a day much like this one, frost on the grass, breath hanging in the air, the bells of the abbey sounding dull through the cold. Since then, Sarah had kept herself within the 4 walls of her little bookshop. That place was more than her work. It was her shelter, a small corner of the city where she could keep the world at a polite distance. She would unlock the door each morning just after dawn, switch on the lamps that cast a golden wash over the shelves, and fill the kettle before slipping into the slow rituals of her day, dusting the display table, arranging the window with care, brewing her tea so it could warm her hands while she sorted the new arrivals. She spoke to customers in a voice that was warm but measured, as though keeping the conversation just a step away from becoming personal. The regulars understood, and the strangers didn't linger long enough to notice. To them, she was simply the quiet woman with the kind eyes who sold them a book and wished them a pleasant day. Outside those walls, Sarah did not seek company. She went from home to shop, from shop to home, and rarely strayed from that short route. Even the park gate, just across from her shop street, was a place she passed without pause. That is why the golden retriever, though at the time she had not touched him, had not spoken to him, was something different. She could have turned her head away and ignored him entirely, but she didn't. Each morning she looked, if only for the briefest second. Sometimes her gaze brushed his gift before returning to the ground. Sometimes it lingered on him just a heartbeat longer than the day before. Dogs notice these things. They count moments not in minutes, but in attention. I could see it in the set of his body, how he never leaned forward in impatience, never barked to demand she come closer. He knew waiting was part of the work. That morning with the blue ribbon had unsettled her. I saw it in the way she kept her head lower than usual when she walked past him the next day. There was no gift in front of him this time, only the patch of frost where one might have been. But his gaze on her was the same, steady, sure, and without judgment. At the shelter, we often talk about how animals carry an understanding that goes deeper than our own. Not magic, not anything that needs a word like mystical, but an instinct for where the wounds are. I have seen half-wild cats curl themselves around the legs of a man who would not meet anyone's eyes. I have seen a nervous greyhound rest her head in the lap of a child who hadn't spoken in weeks. Jasper, though his name had yet to reach me, had that same instinct. Over the next week, the gifts returned, a small conker polished to a shine. A single feather, pale brown with a streak of white down the center. A scrap of folded paper with a pressed flower inside lavender, still faintly fragrant though it was long dried, always placed in the same spot, always guarded until Sarah had passed. One morning, when she was halfway to her shop door, a delivery van slowed beside her. I was close enough to hear the driver greet her, offering to carry the boxes he had for her inside. She thanked him but shook her head, insisting she could manage. Her politeness was practiced, the kind that ends an interaction without offense. She didn't look to see if Jasper was watching, but I did. His eyes never left her, not even when the van pulled away. It struck me that she had built her life to keep everything exactly where she could handle it, not empty, but not too full. And here was this golden figure at the edge of her mourning, placing small, silent invitations in her path. The day came when the frost turned to a fine rain, the kind that beads on your coat without soaking in right away. I passed the park gate with my hood pulled up and saw him there, his fur darker with damp, but his posture unchanged. At his paws was another ribbon, this one green, tied around a folded piece of lined paper. Sarah came along moments later, umbrella low over her head. She glanced at the paper and slowed without meaning to. For just a breath, she looked as though she might stop. Her hand twitched, not toward the gift, but toward the strap of her bag, as if holding on to something would keep her from moving forward. Then she kept walking, the moment slipping away like water down the gutter. I could tell it cost her something to keep walking. From the shelter window later that morning, I saw her through the rain-smeared glass of her bookshop. She was at the counter, arranging a stack of novels, but her gaze was unfocused. On the corner of the counter was a single dried lavender sprig. I doubted she even knew she had carried it in. It is a slow thing, the way a dog can find the cracks in a closed door and rest there, patient and steady, until the door opens on its own. And though she hadn't yet realized it, Sarah's had already begun to shift on its hinges. It was one of those mornings when the light comes late and the air tastes faintly of snow, even if the sky is clear. The abbey bells had not yet sounded the hour, but the square already smelled of fresh bread from the market stalls setting up along the far side. My boots clicked along the cobblestones toward the shelter, each sound bouncing gently between the old stone facades. From halfway down the lane, I saw him. Jasper, though the name still wasn't known to Sarah, sat at his post just beyond the wrought iron park gate. His fur gleamed in the pale dawn, each breath rising in a soft cloud that dissolved before it touched the bars. At his paws was today's offering, a small bookmark cut from thick, cream-colored card. A pressed pansy was glued neatly to its center, its petals deep violet edged with white. A length of twine, looped through a hole at the top, swayed faintly with the breeze. Sarah's figure appeared at the far end of the street, scarf tucked high, her steps steady. But even from here, I could see something was different. She was moving slower, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I have learned to spot the signs of a person turning something over in their mind. Jasper didn't move. His eyes tracked her, calm and intent. The pansy lay between them like an unspoken question. When she reached the curb opposite the gate, she stopped. It was not the accidental kind of pause that comes from checking for traffic. This was deliberate. Her gaze flicked from Jasper's face to the bookmark, then back again. The air between them seemed to hold still, as though waiting for her decision. She crossed the street. Her steps were measured, her hand still buried in her coat pocket, but she was crossing all the same. The iron gate's hinges creaked faintly as she pushed it open, the sound small yet startling in the quiet morning. Jasper stood, his tail giving one slow, sweeping wag, not the eager whip of a puppy, but the deliberate gesture of greeting between old friends. When she stopped a few feet away, he lowered his head slightly, his gaze lifting to meet hers without strain. I have seen hundreds of first meetings between people and dogs, and this one had that rare quality where neither party rushed. Sarah crouched, her knees creaking softly, and reached toward the bookmark. Her gloves brushed the damp grass as she picked it up. She studied it for a moment, her thumb running along the twine. Then she looked at Jasper again. "You're a thoughtful one," she murmured, the first words she had spoken to him, though I was too far to hear them. I could read them in the shape of her lips, in the way her breath moved with the words. Jasper took one step forward and paused, letting her decide the space between them. She extended her gloved hand, palm down, fingers slightly curled. He leaned in just enough to breathe her scent, his nose twitching. His eyes softened, the corners crinkling the way they do when a dog is at ease. For a long moment, they stayed like that, not touching beyond that shared breath, not needing to. The frost beneath them caught the light, turning the ground into a patchwork of silver and pale gold. Sarah rose slowly, the bookmark still in her hand. Jasper sat again, as though content with what had passed between them. She gave a small nod, whether to herself, to him, or to both, I couldn't tell, and stepped back toward the street. When she reached the other side, she looked over her shoulder once. Jasper was still watching, but his head was slightly tilted now, his ears relaxed. If dogs could smile, I think that was as close as it gets. At the shelter later that morning, I found myself thinking about how carefully Jasper had managed that moment. Many dogs, even the gentle ones, can't help but close distance quickly when someone comes near. But Jasper understood the value of space, the importance of letting Sarah come to him. That is not just temperament, that is intention. Over the following days, the space between them began to shrink in small, almost invisible ways. Sarah would pause a little longer at the gate. Jasper's tail would lift a little higher when she appeared. She began to carry his gifts inside the shop, instead of leaving them where they were. Sometimes, I'd see them through the bookshop window in the quiet hour before opening, Sarah dusting shelves, while a lavender sprig or a feather rested beside the till. One morning I caught sight of something remarkable. Sarah knelt fully on the grass inside the gate, Jasper sitting before her, his chest rising and falling in a slow, even rhythm. She reached out and touched the soft fur just above his brow. It was the lightest of touches, her fingers barely bending, but Jasper leaned into it with the kind of trust you can't teach. It was not the opening of a door, not yet, but it was the first hand resting on the latch. When she rose that day, she spoke again. I could tell by the way her mouth moved, and though I could not hear the words, I saw Jasper's ears flick as if catching the tone. He didn't need to understand the language. Dogs often hear what we mean better than we do ourselves. That evening, walking home past the park, I noticed the pansy bookmark was gone from its usual spot in the window display. Perhaps she had sold it with a book, or perhaps she had tucked it somewhere personal. Either way, it had found a place in her life beyond the cold grass at the park gate, and Jasper, I thought, had found a place just inside her guard. Some mornings unfold in the usual way, the same sights, the same sounds, the same quiet exchanges that pass like well-worn coins from one day to the next. And then there are mornings that begin just as ordinary but turn somewhere you do not expect, as if the street itself has shifted under your feet. That morning, the air had the kind of damp cold that seeps into your sleeves no matter how tightly you button your coat. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the kind that looks as if it could dissolve into rain at any moment. The Abbey bells had just finished their slow toll when I stepped onto Henrietta Street, my hands deep in my pockets and my thoughts already on the shelter's first arrivals of the day. Jasper was there, of course, sitting in his usual place, just beyond the iron park gate, his tail making a single, gentle sweep when he saw her. Sarah was walking toward him from the far end, her pace unhurried, but no longer quite as guarded as it had been weeks before. The bookmark with the pressed pansy had been replaced in her shop window with a small display of dog-themed novels, and I wondered if that was a coincidence or a quiet nod to the new presence in her mornings. At Jasper's paws today lay a small, flat pebble. Its surface was smooth and pale, almost white, and in the center someone had painted a tiny sprig of lavender in soft purple strokes. It was the kind of object you find at craft stalls during summer fairs, bought as a keepsake and kept in a pocket until the right moment. Sarah stopped at the gate, looking down at the stone, then at Jasper. For a moment, they simply regarded one another. Then Jasper stood, turned toward the park path, and looked back over his shoulder. It was not the eager glance of a dog hoping for a run. It was quieter than that, almost a question. Sarah hesitated, the kind of hesitation that feels like it could last forever. Her eyes drifted past him to the curve of the path beyond, the one that disappeared behind a stand of leafless trees. I knew that path well. It wound toward the river and opened into a small clearing with a bench facing the water. I also knew, from the soft talk of the market traders, that she had not walked that way since Daniel's funeral. Jasper took 3 slow steps forward, then stopped again, his body angled toward the trees, but his head turned back to her. His ears twitched in the light breeze. His tail stayed low but loose, as if he were holding the moment open for her. She reached down, picked up the painted pebble, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Then, without a word, she pushed the gate open and stepped inside. I stayed where I was, leaning against the railings, close enough to see but far enough not to intrude. Some moments belong only to those living them. They walked slowly, Jasper keeping just ahead, his pace matched to hers. The grass on either side of the path was still heavy with dew, darkening the edges of her boots when she strayed from the cobbled strip. The bare branches overhead formed a kind of arch, their tips rattling softly in the faint wind. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird sang a few clear notes before falling silent again. I could see her shoulders loosen just slightly as they moved deeper into the park. It was not that the grief was gone, that sort of ache never truly leaves, but the act of walking there again, with Jasper's steady presence a few steps ahead, seemed to shift the weight of it. The path curved toward the river, and the sound of water grew clearer, a low, constant murmur. When they reached the clearing, the bench came into view. The wood was weathered to a silvery gray, the grain raised in places by years of sun and rain. A small brass plaque was fixed to the center of the backrest, its edges greened with age. From here, I could not read it, but I knew the words by heart, a date nearly 10 years old, and a single line from one of Daniel's favorite poems. Sarah stopped in front of it, her hands still in her pockets. Jasper moved to her side, sitting close enough that his fur brushed against her coat. For a long while they stood together in silence, looking out at the slow ripple of the river. Then Sarah reached down, her fingers curling into the fur at the top of his neck. Jasper leaned into the touch, his eyes half closing, his breath even. On the bench, resting directly beneath the plaque, was another gift. This one was a torn page from a paperback book, the edges softened by age. In the margin, in faint pencil, was a short note, just 3 words, written in a careful, looping hand: "Take this path." I could not see if she recognized the handwriting, but she held the page for a long moment before folding it carefully and tucking it into her pocket alongside the lavender stone. When she and Jasper began walking back toward the gate, there was something different in her step. Not lighter exactly, but less bound. That morning, she did not pass by me without noticing. She caught my eye, gave a small nod, an acknowledgement, nothing more, and then continued toward the shop, Jasper pacing easily beside her until they reached the gate. He sat again at his post as she crossed the street, watching until she turned the corner. It struck me as I stood there in the thinning light that Jasper had not only brought her to that bench. He had given her the choice to go, the space to decide for herself, and in choosing, she had opened a door that had been closed for a very long time. Bath is a city of quiet currents. News here does not crash through the streets like a wave, it seeps in, the way water finds its way into stone, slowly, invisibly, until you realize it has always been there. If you want to hear what is truly happening, you do not go to an office or a desk, you go to the market. That morning, the square was already stirring by the time I passed through on my way to the shelter. Canvas stalls were being unfolded like sails, the smell of coffee drifted from the cafe on the corner, and the bread stand was stacked high with fresh loaves that steamed in the cold air. "Morning," called Peter, the baker, who has had the same corner pitch for as long as I can remember. His hands were dusted with flour, his cheeks flushed from the oven's heat. I stopped to buy a roll for later, and as he wrapped it in paper, he tilted his head toward the park. "You've seen that golden, haven't you?" he asked. I told him I had, though I kept Jasper's name to myself for now, and Peter leaned in a fraction, lowering his voice as if the bread might overhear. "Belongs to Mr. Avery," he said. "Lives down by the river, or did. Ambulance took him out late last week, so I heard from the postie. Hospital, no family nearby as far as I know. That dog's been at the gate near every day since." The paper crinkled as I took the roll from him. "Do you know which hospital?" I asked, already suspecting the answer. "Royal United," he said. "Ward somewhere up on the north block. I reckon the dog's waiting for him to come back the same way he left." I thanked him and went on, my thoughts heavier than the bread in my pocket. When I reached Henrietta Street, Sarah was just unlocking her shop. Jasper was at his usual post, tail brushing the grass in one slow arc as she passed. At his paws today lay another stone, this one shaped like a heart, with the faint outline of a paw print carved into its surface. She stooped to pick it up, brushing a smear of frost from her glove before tucking it into her bag. She still didn't linger, but she did glance back before the door shut behind her. That small turn of her head told me she was thinking about him even when she walked away. At the shelter, I made a few quiet inquiries. We have our ways, when a dog is in trouble, a loose network of volunteers and vet clinics and kind-hearted shopkeepers can move information faster than most official systems. It didn't take long to confirm Peter's story. Mr. Avery had been admitted with pneumonia. Stable now, the nurse told me, but under observation for at least another week. He had asked that someone keep an eye on his dog. He had also mentioned, and this was the part that stuck, that the dog knew where to go. That afternoon, on my way back through the square, I spotted Sarah standing by the greengrocer's stall, a bag of apples in one hand. Jasper was nowhere in sight. I wondered if she had noticed his absence. You see him today? I asked as I passed. She looked up puzzled. Who? The Golden, I said. He's usually at the gate in the mornings. Her eyes softened almost imperceptibly. Not this morning. He was there yesterday, I nodded. Might be someone brought him in for a rest. He's been out in all weather. I didn't tell her yet what I knew. Some things need the right moment to land. The next morning, Jasper was back, damp from a light rain, but sitting tall, a piece of folded paper under one paw. The paper was from a notepad, the edges uneven, the ink smudged in one corner. I could see from where I stood that it wasn't blank. Sarah approached, her brow creasing as she bent to pick it up. She turned it over in her hand, reading quickly. Whatever was written there made her glance toward the park path, then down the street toward the bus stop. She slipped the note into her coat pocket and stood for a moment, her gaze moving between Jasper and the direction she had come from. Then she went into the shop. I stayed a while longer by the gate. Jasper watched the shop door, his ears flicking each time the bell above it sounded. His patience was a thing you could almost measure in the air, a quiet, steady waiting that did not fray at the edges. When I finally left for the shelter, I had the feeling that whatever was on that paper had placed a weight in Sarah's day that would not shift easily. In the rescue world, we talk often about choice. People think it is about choosing a dog or a dog choosing a person. But more often, it is about a chain of small choices, each one a thread that pulls you closer until you look back and realize you are tied. Sarah was not yet tied to Jasper, but the thread was there. And now there was another thread leading from him to a man lying in a hospital bed on the other side of the city. Those two threads, I thought, were about to cross. In rescue work, you learn to read between the lines of what people say and what they do. When Sarah emerged from her shop late that afternoon with Jasper trotting beside her, I didn't need her to tell me she made a decision. The choice was written in the way her hand hovered just above his shoulder as they walked, not quite touching, but near enough that it could at any moment. They stopped outside the shelter, the fading light catching in Jasper's fur like it had been brushed with copper. Sarah shifted her weight, as though unused to standing at a threshold like this. I think, she said slowly, he might need somewhere warm to be. I nodded, and I think you might have somewhere that's just right. We stepped inside, the familiar scent of sawdust and laundry soap wrapping around us. I pulled one of the spare leads from the wall and clipped it to Jasper's collar, though he hardly needed it. He moved with the quiet assurance of a dog who understood exactly where he was meant to be. While I filled out the temporary care form, I explained the basics. Because his owner's in hospital, it's not an adoption, just a foster. We'll keep the chip registered to Mr. Avery, but note you as the current carer. It's official enough that no one will question why he's with you. Sarah listened closely, her hand resting lightly on Jasper's back. How long? A week, maybe 2, I said. Depends on Mr. Avery's recovery. She nodded once, a small but firm motion, then signed where I pointed. Jasper's tail swept the floor once in a slow arc, as though he understood that something important had just happened. We sent them home with a soft blanket, 2 bowls, and a sack of good food. I offered a crate, but Sarah shook her head. I think he'll be fine without one, she said, and there was a certainty in her tone I hadn't heard before. The next morning, on my way to the shelter, I stopped by the bookshop. The door was propped open to let in the pale winter sun, and Jasper was curled in a patch of light just inside. His head lifted when I stepped over the threshold, and he wagged his tail in that slow, even way of his. Sarah was behind the counter, sorting through a new stack of novels. He's settled in well, she said, carried his blanket to the spot by the front window and hasn't moved much since. That'll change, I told her with a smile. Once he knows this is his base, he'll start exploring. True enough, by the following week, Jasper had made the shop his own. He greeted each customer with a gentle wag, accepted the occasional pat with dignified patience, and returned to his spot in the sun when the doorbell stopped ringing. More than once, I saw him follow Sarah between the shelves, his nose brushing the hem of her skirt as she restocked. He still brought gifts. A dried flower from the crack between 2 paving stones, a torn bookmark that matched the style sold on the poetry shelf. A small, weathered bus ticket, the kind used for the route that climbed the hill toward the hospital. The ticket was the one that caught my attention. When I asked Sarah about it, she gave a small shrug, though her fingers lingered on the slip of paper. Found it at the park gate this morning. He wouldn't move until I picked it up. I told her I'd heard Mr. Avery had been moved to a recovery ward. Might be he's sending you clues, I said lightly, though the look Sarah gave me suggested she was already thinking the same. By the end of the week, the rhythm of the shop had shifted. There was more movement, more life. The bell above the door chimed more often, customers lingering to ask about the golden retriever in the window. Sarah's laugh, a sound I'd rarely heard before, made its way into the space now and then, quick and unguarded. One afternoon, I arrived to find a small group gathered near the front. Jasper was sitting with impeccable posture while a little girl, no more than 6, read aloud from a picture book about dogs. Sarah stood nearby, her arms folded loosely, a soft smile playing on her face. When the girl finished, Jasper lowered his head so she could pat him, and her parents thanked Sarah before leaving with a stack of books. "That happen often?" I asked once the shop was quiet again. "Today was the first," she said, "but I wouldn't mind if it happened again." She glanced down at Jasper, who was now lying at her feet. "It's different having him here. I thought it might be disruptive. Instead it feels—" She trailed off, searching for the word. "Settled," I offered. She nodded. "Yes." Settled. That night, as I locked the shelter, I thought about how quickly Jasper had woven himself into her days. Not by force, not by demanding space, but by filling the spaces that were already there, waiting. Some dogs arrive in a life like a sudden storm. Others arrive like the turning of a season. Jasper, I realized, was the latter, and winter was beginning to thaw. It began with the ticket. Jasper had left it in the same place as always, right at the edge of the park gate, where his gifts waited for Sarah each morning. But unlike the stones and flowers and scraps of paper before it, this one felt more like a signpost than a keepsake. The thin strip of card was damp at the edges from the morning frost. The print faded, but still clear enough to read. Route 4A, a bus line that ran from the city center up the hill to the Royal United Hospitals. Sarah had shown it to me that day with a puzzled look, her fingers brushing over the ink. "You think he means something by it?" she asked. "Could be coincidence," I said, though I didn't believe it. Jasper didn't deal in coincidences. The next morning, he was restless. I'd stopped by the shop before heading to the shelter and found him pacing the front window, his nails clicking softly against the wooden floor. When Sarah opened the door for me, he gave a low chuff, not a bark, just enough sound to let us know he had a plan. He padded over to where the lead hung beside the counter and flicked it with his nose. Then he walked to the door, glanced back at us, and sat. "You want to go somewhere?" Sarah asked. Jasper's tail gave one firm thump. It was still early, the streets not yet crowded. We stepped out into the crisp air, Sarah with the light in hand, me walking alongside. Jasper led us past the square, past the bakery where Peter waved in greeting, and toward the main road. His pace was steady but purposeful, stopping only to check the road before crossing. When we reached the bus stop, he sat again, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, as though waiting for something he knew would come. The bus arrived in a hiss of brakes and a smell of warm diesel. Jasper hopped on without hesitation, guiding Sarah to a seat near the front. I took the one opposite, watching his head turn toward the window as the streets began to climb. Bath from the hill is a patchwork of honey stone and slate roofs, the river curling like a ribbon through its middle. Jasper didn't seem interested in the view. His eyes were locked on the road, ears flicking with each turn. When the bus slowed at the hospital stop, he stood before the doors had fully opened. Sarah gave me a questioning glance, but followed his lead. The air up here felt sharper, the wind carrying the scent of pine from a stand of evergreens near the entrance. Jasper trotted toward the main building, then paused just outside the sliding glass doors. His head tilted slightly, his ears shifting to catch the sounds inside, the muted hum of voices, the beep of distant machines, the soft shuffle of shoes on polished floors. Inside, the reception desk was manned by a woman with kind eyes behind her glasses. I explained who we were and mentioned Mr. Avery's name. Her expression softened further. "Ah," she said, "you must be the friends of his golden." She led us through a maze of corridors, the smell of antiseptic and warm air heavy in the space. Jasper walked between us, his tail level, his steps measured. When we reached a door at the end of a quiet ward, the receptionist stepped aside. "Go on," she said. The room was bright, with mid-morning light spilling through the window. Mr. Avery lay in the bed, his frame lean and drawn but his eyes bright when he saw Jasper. The dog froze for half a heartbeat, then crossed the room in 3 long steps, placing his paws gently on the edge of the bed. He lowered his head until his muzzle touched the blanket near Mr. Avery's hand. The old man's fingers trembled as they threaded into Jasper's fur. "There you are, lad," he whispered, his voice rough but warm. He looked past Jasper to Sarah, and his eyes changed. Recognition lit them, followed by something softer, relief, perhaps, or the comfort of a memory brought to life. "You're Daniel's Sarah," he said, the words certain though his breath was thin. Sarah froze. I could see the question in her eyes, but Mr. Avery didn't give her time to ask. He nodded toward Jasper. "Knew he'd find you, knew he'd keep watch till I could send word." Sarah moved closer to the bed, her hand resting on Jasper's back. "You knew my husband." "Knew him well enough," Mr. Avery said. "Sat with him on the bench by the river a few times. He talked about you, about the shop." I reckon Jasper remembered every word. The room was quiet except for the faint hiss of the oxygen machine and the sound of Jasper's slow breathing. Mr. Avery's eyes grew heavy, the effort of talking wearing him down. "Not long now till I'm back home," he murmured. "But till then, he's yours to look after. He's a good one." Jasper stayed pressed against the bed until the old man drifted into a light sleep. Only then did he step back, his gaze moving between Sarah and the door as though to say, "That's all for now." On the bus ride back down the hill, Sarah kept one hand on Jasper's neck. Her eyes were fixed on the window, but I could tell she wasn't looking at the streets passing by. She was somewhere between memory and what had just happened, her fingers unconsciously stroking the fur beneath them. When we reached the square, Jasper walked beside her all the way to the bookshop door, slipping inside as though it had always been his place. That night I thought about how many threads had been weaving quietly all along, the bench, the gifts, the bus ticket, the way Jasper had waited every morning without fail. None of it was random. He had been drawing the line between them from the start, patient and sure, until the day Sarah was ready to follow. There are visits you make out of duty, and there are visits you make because something in you knows they matter more than you can say. The second time we went to see Mr. Avery, it was Sarah who suggested it. She came into the shelter mid-morning, the shop bell's echo still clinging to her coat. Jasper was at her side, the lid loose in her hand. "He should see him again," she said simply, as though it had been settled in her mind overnight. The bus ride up the hill was quiet. Jasper sat upright between us, his gaze steady on the road ahead. The air outside was sharp with late winter, the kind that smells faintly of wood smoke when you pass certain streets. Bath's rooftop slid away behind us, the honey-colored stone taking on a warmer glow under the pale sun. At the hospital entrance, Jasper paused for a moment, scanning the flow of people. His tail gave one slow wag before he stepped inside. The familiar antiseptic scent wrapped around us, mingled with the faint hum of heating vents. We took the now familiar path through the corridors. Nurses greeted Jasper with quiet smiles, a few stopping to scratch behind his ears. He accepted each with gentle dignity, never breaking stride. When we reached the ward, Mr. Avery was sitting up in bed, a blanket over his knees and a book open in his lap. He looked stronger than before, more color in his cheeks, his voice clearer when he greeted us. "There's my lad," he said, holding out a hand. Jasper moved to his side immediately, resting his chin on the bed just as he had the first time. Mr. Avery's hand sank into the thick fur, his fingers curling in a slow, deliberate stroke. I have seen dogs work magic in moments like this, not with tricks or commands, but with simple presence. Jasper stood still, letting the man set the pace. Sarah stepped closer, her hands clasped loosely in front of her. Mr. Avery's eyes moved from Jasper to her, and a faint smile touched his face. "I wondered if you'd come back," he said. "Not everyone would." Sarah glanced at Jasper, then back to him. "He makes it hard to stay away." Mr. Avery chuckled, the sound soft but real. "He's always been like that, knows who needs him." He shifted slightly, wincing as he adjusted his position. "When your Daniel passed, I saw you at the bench once or twice." "You didn't see me, Jasper did. He's never forgotten a face." The words seemed to settle over Sarah like snow, light at first, but carrying weight as they rested. She moved to the chair beside the bed, lowering herself into it without looking away from him. "Why the gifts?" she asked. "The stones, the flowers, the ribbon." Mr. Avery's gaze softened. "Some of them were his idea. Some I slipped to him, thinking maybe you'd take them in the way they were meant, not to pry, but to say. There's still connection, even when you think it's gone." Sarah's eyes lowered to Jasper, who was now leaning fully against the bed, his body warm against her leg. She rested her hand on his back. "It worked," she said quietly. For a moment, the room was filled only with the low hum of the oxygen machine and the faint rustle of pages as the breeze from the open window turned one in Mr. Avery's book. "You've looked after him well," Mr. Avery said at last. "Better than I could have hoped. I don't have anyone else near. I thought maybe he'd find someone before I got back, but I didn't expect." His voice trailed off, his hand tightening slightly in Jasper's fur. "Didn't expect it would be you." There was a kind of unspoken agreement in the air then, that until he was back on his feet, Jasper would stay where he was, in the bookshop, in the space Sarah had slowly opened for him. "Before we left, Mr. Avery reached to the small table beside his bed and picked up a worn leather collar. The brass tag was dulled with age, the engraving faint but still legible. "Jasper had to take it off for the vet, but it's his," he said, offering it to Sarah. "Better he wear it while he's with you. He'll know it means he's home." Sarah accepted it, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the tag. She crouched to slip it around Jasper's neck, fastening the buckle with care. Jasper gave a small shake, the tag ringing faintly like a tiny bell. On the bus ride back, Sarah sat with her hand resting against that tag, her thumb tracing the engraved letters. She didn't speak, and I didn't press her to. Some moments are better left to settle quietly, finding their place in the heart before they're turned into words. When we reached the shop, Jasper padded straight to his blanket by the window and lay down with a sigh. The brass tag caught the afternoon light, and for the first time since I'd known her, Sarah sat on the floor beside him, leaning against the wall as if she meant to stay there for a while. It wasn't just that she'd taken him in. It was that she'd taken in everything he carried with him, the thread to Mr. Avery, the memory of Daniel, the gifts that had spoken when words would have been too much. And Jasper, ever patient, ever sure, had been waiting for exactly that. By the end of the first week with Jasper, Sarah's shop felt different. I noticed it the moment I stepped through the door one Thursday morning, shaking the drizzle from my coat. The air inside seemed warmer, not just from the heater humming quietly in the corner, but from something softer, a shift in how the space felt lived in. Jasper was stretched out in his usual spot by the front window, his chin resting on his paws, watching the street with that calm, steady gaze of his. The brass tag on his collar caught the light whenever he turned his head, the faint chime of metal on metal adding a new note to the shop's rhythm. Sarah was behind the counter, rearranging a display of hardbacks. "He's becoming a fixture," she said as I joined her. There was no complaint in her voice, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone acknowledging a truth that had quietly settled into place. I watched as a woman passing outside paused to smile at Jasper through the glass. "He's bringing people in," I said. "Not just customers, people, that's different." Sarah gave a small smile and glanced toward him. "He makes it easier. I don't have to think so much about what to say. He starts the conversation for me." Over the next few days, I saw what she meant. Students came in on their lunch break, crouching to stroke his ears before buying second-hand paperbacks. Elderly regulars lingered longer, their talk meandering from the weather to the books they'd loved as children, their hands absently resting on Jasper's back. Children pressed their noses to the window before being coaxed inside, where Jasper accepted their pats with the patience of a saint. Still bringing gifts too, a scrap of ribbon red this time that he dropped beside Sarah's chair while she was doing the week's orders. A pinecone, its scales dusted with frost, left in the doorway one morning before she unlocked it. Once a small brass button worn smooth with age, which he placed carefully on the counter beside the till. Sarah had started keeping them in a shallow wooden bowl on the shelf behind her. "A collection," she called it when I asked, "for when I want to remember these days." One evening, just before closing, I stopped by to find the shop quieter than usual. The last customer had gone, and Sarah was sitting on the floor with her back against the counter, Jasper sprawled beside her. A book lay open in her lap, her free hand resting on his flank. "I don't remember the last time I sat like this," she said when I stepped inside. "Just still. Not doing, not planning, just being." She glanced down at Jasper. "He makes it easy." That weekend, Sarah took him to the park without my prompting. She told me later it felt different walking there now, not as though she were trespassing on old memories, but as though she were adding something new to the place. They'd gone all the way to the bench by the river. Jasper had hopped up beside her, watching the water as she read aloud from a book she'd brought. "He stayed the whole time," she said, a faint amazement in her voice. "Didn't wander, didn't fuss, just sat with me." The shop's regulars began to ask about Jasper's story. Sarah told them parts of it, that he belonged to a man who was recovering in hospital, that she was looking after him for now. She never mentioned the bench, or the gifts, or the way his presence had shifted the air in her life. Some things I think she was keeping for herself. Still, I could see the change in her. There was more movement in her days, more ease in the way she spoke to people. She'd begun leaving the shop door propped open in the afternoons, letting the scent of the market drift inside. When Jasper nudged her with his nose, she would pause whatever she was doing to scratch behind his ears. One night, after locking up the shelter, I passed the shop and saw her inside. The lamps were on, casting a warm glow over the shelves, and she was sitting at the counter with a cup of tea, Jasper curled at her feet. She wasn't reading or writing, just sitting there, looking out at the quiet street. It struck me that she no longer looked like someone holding herself apart from the world. She looked like someone who had let the world in, just enough to make room for one golden retriever, and with him, everything he carried. Jasper had become a home between homes, not yet returned to Mr. Avery, not officially Sarah's, but belonging fully to the space they now shared. And in that space, both of them were finding something they hadn't known they'd been missing. The call came on a Tuesday morning, just as the market was shaking off the dawn chill. I was in the shelter office when the phone rang, the receiver cold against my ear. A familiar nurse's voice told me that Mr. Avery was being discharged the next day. He would be going home, slowly, carefully, but home all the same. I walked to the bookshop with the news, the air damp with the kind of mist that clings to your hair. Sarah was behind the counter, stacking a box of new arrivals, Jasper lying at her feet with his head resting on her boot. "He's coming home," I said. Sarah looked up sharply, then down at Jasper, her hand stilled on the edge of the box. "Tomorrow," I nodded. Her gaze lingered on Jasper's collar, the brass tag catching the low morning light. She didn't speak right away, but I could see the thoughts crossing her face, the understanding that this chapter was nearing its end, the quiet ache of knowing the shop would feel different without him. The next day dawned pale and bright. Sarah closed the shop for the morning, a handwritten note in the window explaining she'd be back by afternoon. Jasper trotted beside us as we made our way to the bus stop, his gait steady, his ears flicking in the cold breeze. The ride up the hill felt shorter than usual. When the bus hissed to a stop outside the hospital, Jasper rose before the doors had fully opened, his eyes fixed ahead. Mr. Avery was waiting in a small reception area, dressed in a heavy coat, a nurse standing nearby with his bag. He looked tired but stronger, color in his cheeks that hadn't been there before. The moment Jasper saw him, his tail began that slow, sweeping wag, his whole body leaning forward in anticipation. When we reached him, Jasper pressed his head into Mr. Avery's hands with a low, rumbling sigh, the kind of sound that only comes from a reunion well-earned. "Good lad," Mr. Avery murmured, his voice thick. "Good, faithful lad." Sarah stood a pace back, watching the two of them. I saw her smile, but it was tinged with something bittersweet. She cared for Jasper, knowing it was temporary, but that doesn't soften the parting. We walked together to a waiting taxi. Mr. Avery moved carefully, leaning on his stick, Jasper pacing beside him with the quiet attentiveness of a dog who knows his person's limits. Sarah helped the nurse with the bag, her movements steady but unhurried. At the flat by the river, the taxi pulled away and the door opened onto a small, neat space with the smell of fresh polish. A blanket had been laid out in the corner, a bowl of water already waiting. Jasper walked the rooms in a slow loop, sniffing each familiar corner before returning to Mr. Avery's side. We stayed only long enough to make sure they were settled. Mr. Avery thanked Sarah, his voice quiet but certain. "You've done more than I can say," he told her. "He's happy, I can see it in him." Sarah knelt to give Jasper one last scratch behind the ears. "Be good," she said softly, and I saw his eyes follow her hand as she stood. The walk back to the bus stop was a quiet one. The river ran slow and brown beside us, the air holding the faint scent of damp leaves. Sarah didn't rush, but she didn't linger either. Back at the shop that afternoon, she propped the door open and set about her work. The space felt bigger without Jasper's warm weight in it, the patch of sunlight by the window empty except for the blanket he'd left behind. But as the hours passed, customers still came, and Sarah greeted them with the same steady warmth she'd found in herself these past weeks. A few days later, I passed by and saw something new in the window display, the shallow wooden bowl from the shelf behind the counter, filled with Jasper's gifts. The painted stone, the pressed flowers, the bookmark, the ribbons, the brass button. Beside it, a small card read, "For a friend who waited." The next week, Mr. Avery came to the shop himself, Jasper at his side. He walked slower now, but his smile was quick and sure. They stayed for nearly an hour, talking quietly in a patch of sun near the front window. When they left, Jasper paused at the door, looking back at Sarah before stepping into the street. As I watched from across the square, I realized the line between them hadn't been cut. It had simply stretched. It would always be there, invisible but strong, woven through every step Jasper had taken to bring her to this point. Hope doesn't always arrive in grand gestures. Sometimes it comes on 4 quiet paws, carrying a stick or a stone or a ribbon, and waits at the edge of your day until you're ready to cross the street. And once you do, it has a way of staying with you even when it walks back home.